taken a bit of a turn to the cultural. It's become interested in how interactive technologies might be used to create new cultural and artistic experiences. This has also involved necessarily and fantastically working with artists as part of the research process. And what this talk is about is how that raises some interesting new ethical issues when this new interdisciplinary practice comes into being. It's an ACM Transactions on Card paper. It's pretty long, so I'm going to skim through it, trying to give a few examples by way of an advert more than anything else. Before we get into the juicy examples of ethical dilemmas, a little bit of background. We're not going to undertake a massive literature review on ethics, but a little bit. So there is, of course, a rich history of ethical thought already within HCI. It's not a blank page. In practical terms, many of us may routinely deal with ethics processes, ethics committee, IRBs, and so on. I don't know how it is in your part of the world, so I'm generalising, but in mine, I think it's fair to say those processes historically are grounded in a sort of medical experimental model. Things are an experiment, participants are subjects. You must think very carefully before you do things to them about what you're doing. You must obtain their informed consent, quite right. The data is analysed, great stuff is produced for the public good. And that's good. Some social scientists have argued that that's not so appropriate to their style of engagement with the world. They say that they go into settings where you really don't know what you're going to find. You have to start reacting on the fly, and consent is something that's built up over time as part of a trusted relationship between the researcher and the setting. So there's already a debate happening. HCI, beyond that, has become very interested in value-centred design. So we're starting to ask bigger questions. What are the values to which we should aspire when we're creating technologies? Let's think about the end state. Where are we trying to get to? And a bit outside of HCI, but I think coming in, is a notion of responsible research innovation. And this kind of, to my mind, is a bit like participatory design of ethical and kind of moral implications. It's getting participants involved in thinking about the futures of technology. So there's a rich tradition that you might set the following discussion against. But, you know, guess what? The arts has a bit of a tradition of thinking about ethics as well. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about the performing arts. Those are the examples I draw on. Interesting question as to how much I say here generalises beyond. I suspect quite a bit will. But we're going to focus on performance. So one of the interesting things about the performing arts is the notion that performance often challenges the moral consensus. It often deliberately confronts it and provokes discussion around it, and that's inherent to performance. The performance scholar Bertolt Brecht famously talked about problematizing the audience position as a witness. What does that mean? He argued that a good performance should involve the audience witnessing something to which they were uncomfortable and actually were morally implicated, that the audience had a responsibility in some sense for what they were looking at, or they had to resolve that. And that was his position about what theatre was. And I think that interactive performance, for example, where you use mobile technologies to take people out onto the streets, where you get people to play roles, take decisions, become the co-generators of content where what they say and do is part of the performance. That, I think, passes on even greater moral agency to the users, the participants. They are morally implicated in the work as well. So there are kind of two rather different lines of thought, I think, and we were interested in reflecting on the sort of practices we've been involved in about how those sat together. And the way we set about discussing this was Blast Theory, one of the artists we worked with for many years, staged a workshop called Act Otherwise. It was a 3-day workshop. They invited or got 40 participants to come. Those participants were other artists. They were venues, curators, arts funders, HCI researchers, and also researchers who were exploring this notion of responsible research innovation. The workshop took the form of a dialogue. It was quite confessional. People were encouraged to bring forth stories of difficult situations they had faced, and the idea was they would be discussed in an open and constructive way so that people were able to kind of divulge moments they'd had in their practice and research that they found problematic. it's quite hard to have an ethical discussion just sitting around the table with a blank page. So it was seeded with the work of 4 different artists who were all present at the workshop and who began the confessional process. They were Blast Theory themselves, who've done a lot of work on mobile theatre, moving out onto the streets where the everyday world and other people get implicated or involved in the experience. Pardon me. Brendan Walker, who's published a lot of work on explorations of fear and thrill. For example, putting biosensors on people on roller coasters, broadcasting their data and video views of them so that loved ones and other audience members can have a close-up experience of what they're going through. Rachel Jacobs' work, which is rather more gentle, but has dealt with the issue of kind of climate change data, where she's talked to climate change scientists about how can she interpret historic data, for example, in this case, burning it onto large sheets of paper and then displaying it and getting people to enact being censors. And last of all, Urban Angel, who are probably the youngest and perhaps therefore most edgy of the groups, who were very into alternate reality games. And they looked to make experiences that blurred the relationship between fiction and reality as far as they could. The work they talked about was based upon a scientific conspiracy, and it involved participants going to different places, exploring a university, finding things, staging a street protest, and at one point witnessing a kidnapping, apparently. The only other thing to say about these works is they've all also been published in the HCI literature. So they're not only crazy art projects, but have all served as HCI research projects at the same time. And that's where some of the ethical tensions and questions began to emerge. So, a whistle-stop tour through some of the issues as a way of encouraging you to just kind of take a look at them in the paper. So these were the themes that emerged from the discussion. The first was an overarching theme, the notion of transgression. Artistic participants, venues and creators repeatedly pointed out to how artists are inherently transgressive in what they do, at least many of them, certainly the ones who were in the room. This took 2 forms. Thematically, the role of the artist as trickster, or the court jester, to say things that are otherwise difficult to say in society. And this means taking on sometimes difficult thematic material. Blast Theory's work on the Gulf War in Desert Rain, or on surveillance and terrorism, for example. The second is also structural, that artists have a habit of breaking and remaking artistic forms. Whenever you think you understand what a performance is as a theatregoer, somebody comes up with something that blurs the boundaries, and then you're no longer sure whether you're in a performance or whether what you're looking at is an artwork or not. And so these 2 transgressions go in hand, often confronting and confounding participants who take part. The second thing that came up was boundaries. The performers pretty much universally described how a key part of their professional practice was to judge individuals' boundaries in participatory works. It was about understanding how far you could take somebody along a journey of confronting an issue before you had really overstepped a line. And that was felt to be very much part of the craft of the performance. This clearly relates back to the observation I made about social scientists before. It's a matter of incrementally building trust rather than getting someone to sign up in advance and say, yes, I'm happy to go just this far in a process I don't understand, but no further. It could also be deeply challenging. It's no easy task. Are participants acting in character or not? One of the artists staged a text messaging narrative game exploring teenage issues, during which one player started talking a lot about wanting to commit suicide, to the point where they were really unsure as to whether this person was acting in character or not, and they had a very long discussion with the TV production company themselves about what should they do about it. Urban Angel entered a situation where, because their players were familiar with alternate reality games, and because the rules were blurred, the players took the law into their own hands and decided to stage their own street protests. And so suddenly the rules of the piece were out of the artist's hands, and they were in some kind of new space. And it's really hard to judge boundaries in those situations. Informed consent, familiar territory. This is one of the cornerstones of our ethical processes as researchers. Artists on the whole are not keen on this process. For some reason, they don't like the idea that when they've carefully created a performance and designed every aspect of it, the first experience people have is of a researcher asking them to sign a consent form. As a result, there's an uneasy compromise in many studies where researchers recruit a few dedicated people who do consent and then ignore the rest who go through the work in the normal way. However, some artists use apparent consent as a tactic. In Blast Theory's Ulrika and Eamon Compliant, you are asked several times if you want to go on at this point. Are you sure you want to progress? This may be a question about consent, but I think it's more preparation for the next stage of what's going on. And participants, again, may think it's part of the game. It's really not clear whether the players in Urban Angel's game actually believed that our researchers were independent of the game or part of it, because it was about scientific conspiracy. And one of them visited our offices several weeks later, still trying to play the game and talking to us. So, is there any informed consent in artworks? Well, yes, of course there is. People make informed decisions about what to go and see and what they expect all of the time. How do they do it? The works are in a recognised venue very often, and they've been curated, and there's advertising, and there's reviews, and there's ticketing, and there's ratings on some of them. So it's not that consent isn't informed, but it's differently given, and it's differently informed. Withdrawal. You can walk away from an artwork, you can walk away from my talk now, you can shout abuse at me for how rubbish it is and walk out the room. It's as easy as that. Well, unless you're on a roller coaster that Brendan Walker's put you on, then it's kind of quite hard to stop a roller coaster when it's in flight. Or unless you're doing a Blast Theory work, because they take your phone and wallet away from you at the start as a way of upping the ante. So if you stop doing the work, well, where are you? You're in the middle of a city with nowhere to go. Well, I'll just come back to the roller coaster example as well. If you go back to a paper at Chi 98, there's a really nice example of somebody on one of Brendan's coasters pleading for the ride to be stopped on behalf of somebody else sitting next to them. Normally, ride operators on roller coasters ignore this kind of thing. Unless there's physical danger involved, they kind of make the assumption that we're not stopping the ride. If you're screaming, we'll just press the button. When it's a matter of public record and it's being spoken over a channel to an audience, it's quite a different ethical matter. Integrity is my last theme before we move on. So artists spoke a great deal about integrity, and this meant a number of things. It certainly, in regard to themselves, meant freedom of expression. And, you know, if HCI is looking for value-centred design, and I think it's right it should be, then freedom of expression is one you would champion very heavily, I think, in this area. Also, integrity to their material. If you're dealing with terrorism, you need to take it seriously and say your piece seriously and not be afraid of what you say about it. And to their audience. So Rachel tried to show people live scientific data from remote forests. But if the data failed, she would fudge the data in order to give them an experience. She made that cool, even though some of the scientists on the project were a bit, well, it's not really live scientific data anymore, is it? And of course, researchers talked a lot about their own integrity. And I won't go into more detail, but we have, of course, our integrities and loyalties in the room too. Well, those are the kind of themes we discuss in the paper. At the end, we draw out two bigger topics to think about going forward in the future. One is, it seems to us that there are two different ethical framings at play here. And of course, what's interesting is when a project is both artwork and HCI, it needs to speak to some extent, both of these frames. And that's, of course, when tensions can arrive, particularly if they have different cultures or different ways of approaching issues. It also gets particularly confused when artists embrace scientific framings. So when Urban Angels say that it's a science experiment gone wrong to the audience, or when Brendan presents a roller coaster ride as an experiment, which he does and the press report it, then you've kind of got a research project within a project that's claiming to be a scientific project. And then it's really hard to untangle some of these issues and to think, do audiences understand what's going on? It's also difficult when researchers do art or appear front of stage. So when people who are collecting in consent forms appear to be part of the performance, what meaning is there in consent anymore? The last issue we raise in the paper is, when is ethics done? And this, I think, reflects the responsible research innovation argument about thinking about ethics throughout the process. So it seems artistically difficult for reasons I've given to do a lot of consent on the way in. I think there might be a corresponding argument for doing a lot of ethics on the way out. One thing about art is letting people shout, scream, say their piece, say why they were offended, and have a fight with you. And of course, that's the way the art world works. You can provoke people, you can offend them, and what you expect to get is then a public beating for doing it. And that's part of the ethical process, I think. It's provoking an ethical debate. But it's possibly challenging for universities to want to get too involved in that debate, or at least for HCI-oriented departments that I work in to want to do that. How might we act otherwise? The final thing was, what should we do about this? It was a terrific discussion over 3 days, and we all loved it. Hope you've enjoyed some bits of it. More sharing under Chatham House rules was deemed to be good. Confessionals were appreciated by everyone. Artists enjoyed being able to share the things that had gone wrong in a space that didn't appear to be telling them off for it, and that was really good. Guidelines seemed bad. Nobody knew what to do with them. Artists talked about internships and an apprenticeship model of how they learn their trade, and so maybe that's how this stuff gets passed on. And of course we need to discuss with our ethics committees. And at that point I'll shut up and take any questions. Thank you. Please.
Hi, I'm Joëlle, Harvard Graduate School of Design. I had a question. I was wondering, okay, let me try to phrase it for 1 second. Especially for artists in HCI, there's always a kind of a stereotype attached to them in research lab and so on, where the artist is expected to always be a bit crazy or radical, and is often dismissed as doing art, quote unquote, and therefore not rigorous in the sense of the HCI expectation. And I was actually wondering whether your approach might reinforce or not some of those stereotypes where there is always this notion that artists are contributing to HCI from a transgressive perspective. But I'm offering maybe a different proposal, or a proposal that completes yours, which is that I find that art is often one of the most interesting way to test technologies in the public domain, where it's one of the most compelling and accessible mediation for new technologies.
Okay, so thank you. It's a really great question, because it really points towards something I didn't say and should have said. So firstly, I mean, I don't think that being transgressive is being crazy, and I think, you know, that's a misreading of what serious artists are doing, and I think that's why it's important to look at some of the performance studies and ethics literature and understand what it means. But secondly, what I didn't say, you know, I had some fun in the talk raising some of the challenges, and of course I didn't give the answers as to what artists do when a teenager appears to be talking about suicide. And the answer is, they are extraordinarily professional about how they handle the issues. They're not crazy. They're not going into these things open-minded. Artists who work in proper venues with public funding, creative money, have a very rich tradition of how they deal with ethical issues. So what I would say, something I didn't say in the talk, was enough about how artists are not just out there being crazily transgressive, doing wacky things. They are being very thoughtfully transgressive, at least the ones we worked with, and thinking through how those things are done, and understanding that's really important. Thanks for
reminding the audience of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ashley McCain, University College London. I really enjoyed the talk. I found it very provoking. And the framing that you had, the performance framing and the HCI framing, made me think about my own work. So within the HCI framing, I'm on the health and well-being side of it, which includes a touch of the medical. Mm-hmm. However, some of us are trying to bring in the cultural into that, values in design. Where does that fit? Because it's somewhere where the medical IRB might be appropriate, but we're bringing in. Have you thought about that? Is that?
I haven't thought about that specific case, and I guess any answer I give would be just horribly vague. Other than, I think the important thing is to at least to understand what the ethical frames of reference are that are on the table in the interdisciplinary project, and try and be reasonably explicit that they're there and how people deal with them. So, if you feel you're in a situation where you both have to pay careful attention to traditional medical ethics, but that there is also some other frame of reference around design, then I guess what you need to do is make that explicit through discussion and practice. Very, very vague answer, but I think that is the point, yeah.
Hello, Pablo Paredes from Stanford. What about the tension? I love the tension that you create, but what about the tension with the pragmatics of ethics versus the actual theory of it? Because IRB and CPHS are many times not really taking care of the risk of the patient. They are covering a little bit the institution's back, right? They are trying not to get sued. And they spend a lot of time trying to be very careful to find risk when sometimes there is no risk, or just exacerbating risk in some studies. So I really think there's a third component, or even more, where we're actually being pressed by a corporate and liability world. How do you find liability also interacts in this model of tension between art, HCI, but also when we're getting in this murky area of what if I get sued by anybody from any of those people who actually appear there?
I think that those kind of layers of ethical thought and practice are actually there's part and parcel of how it works in general. So I think in any of these situations there are actually valid concerns about risk and institutional reputation, as well as thinking about the participants, as well as and it's also true of the artwork. So again, if you are a professional artist working within a recognised art world in venues, those same issues do come up. There are institutional reputations to be protected. There are cables that people are not allowed to fall over and injure themselves. They are there as well. So, yes, what's my answer to my question? They are all part of the ethical process, yeah, in my opinion.